Wow, just an enormous welcome to everybody. It's such a pleasure to see you all here after so much planning for this event. I'm Taylor Ricketts. I'm the director of the Gund Institute for Environment here at UVM, and I have the pleasure to co-host this meeting with Jane Lubchenco and Heather Tallis, whom you'll hear from in just a minute. We are here to kick off what is almost a full week of discussions and brainstorming about developing policy proposals and ideas, moving the US economy towards one with nature at its core. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge the history of the place where we're gathering. This campus has been a place of gathering for a very, very long time, stewarded for centuries and generations by indigenous people, in particular the Western Abenaki. And this kind of weaving together of water and land and people over centuries is mirrored in the mission and the work of the university. It's also really mirrored, I think, in the topics we're focused on here this week, centering nature in policy and economy. Also, I think the serious and continuing and harmful impacts of colonization are important to acknowledge when we're gathering at a place like this, as we continue to do the gathering that's happened for centuries here. And again, especially when we're focused on how to move our policies and economy toward one that's more centered on nature. So for that reason and lots of others, I'm just delighted that this is happening here. And I'm delighted also that the Gund Institute, where I work on campus, is hosting this part of the overall effort here at UVM. Personally, my whole career has been moving between the worlds of science and action, science and conservation, science and policy. Before working here, I worked at World Wildlife Fund and continue to try to erase the line between science and action with what I do with my time. Also, the Gund Institute this week really embodies our mission and what we're here to do at UVM and in the world. So what I want to do is just tell you for 1 minute about the Gund Institute, the place you're sitting, the place that's hosting us, then a little bit about this event, and then I'm going to introduce Jane. So you can think of the Gund Institute at UVM as like an accelerator for interdisciplinary research around real-world solutions to environmental problems. We have about 200 faculty and postdocs and graduate students and staff working here on that problem from every school and college of the university, all corners of this place. But it's not just limited to UVM. We have global affiliates, of whom many of you are. Is that the right way to say that? Many of you are those? Okay, moving on. And I think collectively that represents about 50 other organizations in a dozen countries. So it's a big community trying to erase silos within academics and connect research to policy. So we seed new collaborations, kind of like this. We train future leaders, many of whom are here. We connect research to action, and we convene gatherings just like this one. So you can imagine why it's so exciting to be the host of such a great event. So this event to me is about understanding the importance of nature to our economies and livelihoods and health and security, working to build policies and institutions that recognize that and mainstream that, and again, busting up those silos, both within academic lines of thinking and also between the worlds of science and action. To me, this event right now feels like a really hopeful thing to be spending time on. I hope you agree. It feels forward-looking, it feels front foot type of thing. For me, it's a time of just being reactive and often on the defensive, and thinking ambitiously and proactively has felt really good. And I think that's gonna be true all this week. What also has felt really good is co-organizing this with Heather and Jane, two people I've known for a very long time, and a fantastic excuse to spend more time together. The last thing I want to do is just thank the Gun Institute staff, who I'll introduce by name later, but just collectively, this event happens, as everything happens in the Gun Institute, because of them. They're around. Thank them when you see them. And again, a little bit later, I'll get more specific. Okay, so here's what's coming today. This morning, only. Wow, that's hard to see. All right, we're doing the first thing. Then we're going to hear from Jane, who's going to make the case for why we should be doing this in the first place. Then we're going to hear from Heather about a framework we're going to use not only today, but all week to evaluate and brainstorm and compare policies and ideas. Then we're going to chat with them a little bit, and then we're going to hear from you, crucially. So that's going to be your chance to, primed by Heather and Jane, give us your ideas around your tables and then fed to us for the rest of the week. There'll be a smaller group working all week to develop these ideas. And this, in part, in very large part, is to get raw material and the best ideas from you all that we can consider going forward. And then we'll close up. So now I just want to introduce Jane Lubchenco. I think almost all of you know who she is. She's a renowned environmental scientist, enormous lifelong champion for science and its importance to society, an incredibly strong and effective leader, and inspiring to just so many, including me. Jane's a professor at Oregon State University. I think she's been there for like 50 years. I hope that's roughly right. Yeah, okay. Marine ecology, spends a lot of time in the intertidal zone. She's also, of course, been a fantastic leader in the federal government, appointed first by, well, not first, but among the many things, appointed by Obama to be administrator of NOAA and part of Obama's famous Dream Team for Science. And then more recently in the Biden administration, in the White House Science Office, OSTP, leading the climate and environment sides of all that. So throughout, she's been this wise and steady voice for the importance of science in the public sphere and the science in informing smart policies. And this week and this topic is just the perfect example of that continuing. So here's Jane to lay out the case. Welcome, Jane Lubchenco.
Hi, everybody. So glad to see all of you here. Thank you for joining us. I'm curious as to who's in the room. How many of you are students here at UVM? All right, excellent. How many of you are from Vermont? Outside of Vermont? Okay, so we have a really good cross section. How many of you have spent time in a state government? Excellent. Federal government? Local government? Okay, this is fantastic. We actually didn't design all this because a lot of you heard about it and joined us, but this is going to be a really great cross-section. We're here to talk about nature and nature's benefits and how important it is to our lives, how we are not currently recognizing that in our policies and practices, and what the consequences of not recognizing it are, and what we might do about it. And we need to take advantage of your collective expertise, your wisdom, your experiences, your connections, to help us think about options, because this is a moment in time when we can think boldly about how things should be. It is a time of disruption, it's a time of challenges, and those times can be a perfect incubator for really good things happening or really bad things happening. So let's take advantage of all of you and think about how we can influence what happens in the future. As Taylor said, I'm a marine ecologist. You can tell from my blue hair. I'm also channeling nature, not only the ocean, but I've got my terrestrial biodiversity here. So we're going to get in the spirit here. So we are focused right now on the need for transformative changes, not just nibbling at the edges, but really thinking systemically about how can we do a better job. That doesn't mean this is a revolution that's going to upend everything, but it means that we can't just continue to make either baby steps or backsliding, which is what is happening now. So the case for policy change focused on rapid transformation. We know that we are losing nature at a precipitous rate. I was just in New York City. The American Museum of Natural History has a new exhibit called Impact on the asteroid that crashed and was the demise at the end of the Cenozoic, demise of the dinosaurs. We have another mass extinction event underway, but this is not just about species. This is about the interactions of those species with each other, with the environment, and how that in turn affects the things that affects all of us. So it's nature and nature's benefits that are changing, and that interacts with and exacerbates climate change. Nature loss is not a subset of climate change. It's on a par with climate change in terms of its importance, its ramifications for us. It's not recognized as that. And those two drivers of change are intimately interconnected with our economic systems. And so we can't think of these as separate silos. We need to be thinking about them in a much more integrated fashion. Coastal flooding is a prime example of this. We know that coastal flooding is happening much more frequently and in a more intense way because of climate change, but those impacts can also be caused by or can be exacerbated by loss of barrier islands, loss of dunes, loss of marshes. In Louisiana, in New Orleans, they talk about barrier islands as speed bumps to hurricanes. That is an ecosystem service. That is part of nature's benefits. So those factors interact with one another, and they affect all aspects of our lives. Nature has been sort of seen as a background issue. Because the loss of nature and nature's benefits is happening increasingly rapidly, it is no longer a background issue. That has been recognized as important by many people, and it has been incorporated into, for example, the US National Security Strategy that the Biden administration issued, had biodiversity, climate change as part of the national security strategy through the language of natural security. Infrastructure losses are a prime example of how loss of that natural infrastructure is now causing lots of ramifications, economic as well as health and security. Food systems and economic dependence or risks. The most recent World Economic Forum Global Risk Report highlighted 2 of the top 10 near-term and 5 of the top 10 long-term risks as environmental. So there's increasing recognition that we have a challenge. Many policy leaders in both the private and public sectors are calling for economic transformation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the World Economic Forum, the Dasgupta report that was a report for the UK Treasury, all talk about an economy with nature at its core. So there's increasing recognition. We know this is a thing, but progress is really, really slow. The scale of change that is needed, we believe, is on par with the very massive changes that were unleashed with the Marshall Plan, or with, for example, the Bretton Woods Agreement that sort of laid out a different pathway and connected the dots and said, okay, this is where we need to go, and let's make it happen. The UK Dasgupta report calls for transformation, but the policy doesn't map onto that. So we have lots of needs, but policy is definitely one of them. And that's what we're focusing on in these conversations. Policy changes that will reflect the magnitude of the challenges and the opportunities, but that will also enable things to happen because the changes are done in a very savvy and smart way. Not just incremental, not just solving this little problem, but something that is much more systemic, much more impactful because it is strategic. Even a lot of the good things that have been put out there, there's now backsliding on. And so this is exacerbating the problems, but we can learn from that. Why is that happening? What are the changes that need to happen that take advantage of that knowledge? What is our Marshall Plan agenda? Where do we think we could go? How can we have a much more comprehensive approach? When Heather and some of the others of you in the room were in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, we instituted a number of things that were aimed at making the kinds of policy changes that are needed. Putting nature on the economic balance sheet of the country, for example. Creating the appetite for permission to do nature-based solutions, et cetera. We can learn from all of those lessons, but those are still not at the scale that is needed. So we can build on those experiments, some of which are still underway, but figure out what more is needed. We have a number of forcing factors that are in play. The catastrophes that are happening because of these losses, number one. Number two, the political disruption that is underway is creating the need for something different. And so the time is right here. We're not talking about going back in time. We're talking about going forward, recognizing the new realities, natural, political, economic, social, all those new realities. Let's think about the future. So, what you all are here to help us do is think through what an agenda could look like. It would be a set of practices and policies that would drive fundamental changes in the way we think about and manage the economy that recognize nature at its core. Recognize nature at its core. What does that look like? What does that mean? So we're not talking about an environmental agenda. That kind of marginalizes nature as this thing that's apart from our economic systems, from our other policy. We're talking about really looking at what is at the center of everything. You might do some thought exercises. What ifs? What would a world look like if we were implementing this? So look at these examples and think through your other what ifs. That's a very useful way of sort of turning this on its head. Where would we like to land? So what if, for example, nature, not concrete, was our primary go-to frontline defense against sea level rise and atmospheric rivers? So that's a good example of a what if. What would it take to do that? What are the impediments? How do we get around those? So we can do some thought exercises like those what ifs. For our purposes today, we're going to focus on federal action. We know full well that that's not the end-all and be-all of everything. And those of you who are here who have had experience with local governments and state governments. There's a lot of really important work to be done at those levels. They can be incubators. They can be testing, test boxes for ideas. We know those are important, but we're going to focus on the federal level just for the sake of starting someplace. And what would that look like? So focusing on the federal level, what the US does matters to the rest of the world, not in ways that are often asserted, but we know that what we do actually can have influence. And we are looking at opportunities. Because of this time of political change, we're looking at times or opportunities that might come about, and the question is, if there are opportunities, do we have something that will be ready when that time comes? So we recognize the roles of different levels, but focused on the federal action. I also want to emphasize that this is not something that is a partisan agenda. Nature affects all of us. Nature is nonpartisan. And the solutions, if they're going to be durable, need to be ones that work for people across the political spectrum. So as we think about the changes that are needed, let's think comprehensively about what that would look like, who it benefits, who needs to be at the table, and how we can design the kinds of changes that put nature at the center in ways that benefit everybody. So, invitation to all of you. We're setting the stage. Heather's going to provide a framework for thinking about, in a more systematic fashion, thinking about levers of change. But we want this to be not only an invitation, but an exciting opportunity for all of you to think outside the box. Use your experiences, use your knowledge, be bold. Nobody's going to hold anybody to anything, so let's just populate this with some really crazy ideas. Imagine a path to an economy that recognizes nature at its core. So that is the opportunity for all of you. And to continue this, it's my pleasure to introduce Heather. Am I introducing Heather or are you? I'm introducing Heather. Dr. Heather Tallis is what is your title? Senior advisor? Senior fellow at the Center for Coastal Resilience, Climate Resilience, at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Heather was a very dynamic and inspirational part of the climate and environment team that we had at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. But she has deep experience in many different facets of what it is that we're talking about. And she really has been the driving force and the inspiration for a lot of what it is that we're doing today in the next few days. So Heather, it's a pleasure to introduce you, and take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jane. Just checking you all can hear me. Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you again for all being here with us, for accepting our bold invitation. And we really are expecting a lot. So just to be clear, we're expecting a supernova explosion of amazing transformative ideas. So I hope you all there's still more coffee if you need it. You'll have a chance in a minute to get some more if you need it. But what I'm going to try and do now is just get a little bit of structure for us to use in thinking about how we create the kind of path that Jane just described as what we need. So I'm going to just briefly introduce a couple of frameworks that we hope can be suggestive guideposts, not rules we need to follow. If you hate these frameworks, forget that I said anything and just come up with ideas that are exciting to you. So I do think it's pretty clear that the call that Jane just gave us is really out of the box from what we have in current federal policies. We have initial steps, we have first moves, we have some foundational pieces that give us entry points to make these kinds of changes in our economy, but we really are not anywhere close to what the global calls and reality of evidence suggests we need. So I'm going to use these two frameworks to give us nudges, one towards what is actually transformational policy, and this is the levers for change, many of you might be familiar with, but we can transform the economy in all kinds of ways, some of which we might not like, and some that don't align with nature at all. And so to nudge us towards that end of the spectrum and an actual economy that's integrated with nature, I'll just remind us what the major drivers of nature loss are. So we're thinking about those most significant connections to the economy that need to shift. So starting with the levers for change, levers for systems change, this is a framework that has been in place for a couple of decades and has been useful for many in thinking about what transformation actually is, what kinds of policies or actions actually drive transformation in a system. This comes from systems thinking from Donella Meadows. It's been developed and advanced by many others since her introduction of it and applied in many sectors and disciplines. So it's something that might be useful for us to think about in thinking about what kinds of actions are likely to have stronger leverage in a complex system, which arguably we have in our social, ecological, economic system in the US. So the main point is that on the outer end of the lever, or the far side from me, are the kinds of actions that are more likely to fundamentally and foundationally change a system, and the kinds of actions on the left are less likely to make really structural differences. So I don't want you to memorize these names or worry too much about exactly what goes in every bucket, but I'm going to introduce the levers quickly with an example from the environmental context, again, just to help nudge your thinking. So on the far right end are a set of actions that really focus the intent of the system. What is it the system is trying to achieve? What are we actually trying to do with it? So the furthest out lever is the power to transcend paradigms. So to actually keep your mind as open as possible, anywhere, any way of thinking, any discipline, any worldview. And this might feel way, way out of the box for federal policy, but we actually have federal policies that provide this power to federal agencies. And one example is a policy that was advanced by the Biden administration that asked all federal agencies to recognize indigenous knowledge as a form of evidence. So that's a direct call to agencies to be open to knowledge and information from multiple worldviews, Western science, indigenous knowledge, and take that information and consider it as useful. So that's a policy that keeps us open to different paradigms. The mindset of the entire system is really formational and important, and in fact what Jane laid out is a mindset shift, right, that we'd love to see adopted in federal policy. So I want to spend just a minute on this because this is a really powerful leverage point that we've already set up for you, that we hope you come up with great ideas for how we can pull. But I want to encourage you too to think about what are the mindsets that need to be in place for these kinds of changes to happen. What kinds of paradigms would you like to see adopted? And so the one that we have now, dominantly for our economy and the relationship to nature, is basically that the economy should minimize harm to the environment. That's sort of the starting mindset of the best that we can do. We know there's lots of other mindsets we could have about the role of the economy. As an example, we could have the mindset that the economy should meet our needs and improve nature. The UK biodiversity net gain policy actually formalizes that intent for the UK economy, right? It says our economy should develop and improve nature in every development decision that we support. So these are all feasible changes to make, and of course we can go to other mindsets too. There are many tribal nations in the current US that have held other ideas, other mindsets for what the economy is and what it does. For example, that the economy should build relationships and that we should treat nature as kin. So these are just prompts for you to have a broad mind space about what we can do with this lever around mindsets and paradigms. Sorry, I'll just go back. And then the third major lever in that part of the framework is that we can set goals of the system. You're probably very familiar with this. We set national goals in policy all the time. The 30 by 30 goal from America the Beautiful, the national climate goals. So this should be a familiar space, but all kinds of things can become national goals. So what kinds of national goals would actually shift the way we're thinking about nature and the economy? So then the next set of levers is around the foundational design of the system. What are the options for self-organization that gives flexibility for people to make actions that are relevant for where they live and how they work? What are the rules of the system? And this is broadly the laws, the guidance, the standards, the governance. And what are the information flows? Who knows what, when, and how? So those are levers in that realm. As an example, all of our laws are rules, but one that's very relevant today is a rule that was passed by the Army Corps a couple of years ago that required all major water infrastructure projects advanced and analyzed by the Corps to include a nature-based alternative in the set that's analyzed. So that's a rule change that causes a change in behavior of a major agency that's making a lot of decisions about nature and the economy. The next set of levers is around how quickly the system can change. All different kinds of feedbacks and pacing mechanisms that are set by the structure of the system and by the rules that are in place. So there can be reinforcing feedbacks like climate change itself, where rising temperatures affect albedo, which further rises the temperature, which further affects other changes in the system. So policies can change the speed of those feedbacks. There's balancing feedbacks that work in the other way. So something like a congestion policy for transportation, where there's peak traffic, there's a fee or a higher limit on what it costs to go into an area of a city that dampens the interest in being there and driving at that time, and so reduces congestion. So policies can affect those feedbacks, and then we can just affect relative delays, either making them longer or speeding them up. Most of what we often celebrate as policy changes falls in this category, because this is where funding goes when we're funding an existing program. So as an example, doubling the amount of money available in USDA's Conservation Reserve Program speeds up farmer activity and interest in converting actively managed areas into habitat recovery. It overcomes a delay in the system. And then the final set of actions are in the basic parameters of the system. So stocks and flows are the stocks and flows of, say, number of fish in a population, or the age structure, or the number of dams or roads, or the amount of infrastructure in the system. Buffer sizes are the capacity of the system to respond to a change. The most common one that I think of in a government context is staff capacity. So how many people are there with the skills ready to respond to a change or implement a new policy? But this could also be like the number of EV buses available to help more people move on public transportation. And then the final is constants and numbers. This is the really basic literal parameters, like changing a speed limit or a catch limit on a fishery, just literally changing numbers in existing rules that change what's happening. So that's the framework. Again, the main intent is to help you make sure you're thinking across the spectrum of what we can change through policy. And this isn't a perfect framework. It doesn't work great for everything all the time. So please just use it as suggestions. As one caveat, often policies are changing multiple things at once, moving multiple levers at a time for good reasons. You can set a goal that's a high leverage action, but if there's nothing in place underneath that, at the other parts of the system, it's pretty hard to meet that goal. So there often needs to be combinations of actions across these levers. So what I really want to encourage you to do is just think, as you have time today to brainstorm, am I missing high leverage actions? Am I spending a lot of time thinking about levers at the sort of lower end of influence? If I am, is there a higher lever action that goes with that that's really going to catalyze the things I'm thinking about to happen faster? Or are there lower lever actions that are going to critically stand in the way of my great big ideas? So try and just use this to nudge your thinking to cover the spectrum. But again, we can transform systems in all kinds of ways. Many of them would move us away from integrating nature into the economy. And so we want to make sure we're focused on the kinds of changes that are going to change the behaviors that really matter for underpinning this kind of a different economy. So here, this is probably going to be a big review for most of you, but just to do the review, we're going to go back over the major drivers of nature loss. So you're thinking clearly about who the major economic actors are that are holding the reins for a lot of this change. So obviously, as we've been talking a lot, the economy is fully embedded in the natural environment, very interdependent and reliant on nature, and interacting with nature in many different ways across different sectors and different actions. Not all of these interactions are the same. Some are positive, some are negative, some are strong, some are weak. And so we want to focus on the strong ones that are currently causing nature declines. So the same 5 major drivers of nature loss in the US have been these 5 since my first Intro to Cons Bio class, now almost 30 years ago. So a great indicator that we are not causing transformative change. So those 5 are pollution, habitat loss, invasive species, overuse and damage of natural resources, and climate change. So you all probably know those by heart, but those aren't agencies, you probably know that, in any government. Those aren't economic sectors. So for us to be designing policy that affects those drivers of loss, we need to know functionally who and what parts of the economy are causing those major changes. And so the 8 black bubbles in the economy there are the 8 in the US according to the OECD last environmental outlook, and also to the draft nature record assessment, which I have to mention because Jane and Taylor and I are all involved in that, as I know several other of you in the room are. So very briefly, this is a new assessment of the state of nature in the US. It's out for public comment right now. Please take a look and help us improve it. But it is also informing and reminding us what the top drivers of nature loss are in the US today. So again, probably very familiar information, but just to reiterate, transportation, mostly shipping, and agricultural imports are our 2 top drivers of introduction for invasive alien species. Agricultural land use and infrastructure development are the 2 top drivers of habitat loss and projected to continue to be to 2050 in the US. Agricultural land use overall is shrinking in total, but we continue to convert new land as fields are abandoned or new crop areas are developed. So this is still a driver of conversion in the US. Pollution in this case is primarily freshwater pollution, but also coastal marine pollution, primarily still driven by agricultural runoff of overuse of fertilizers and pesticides. Of course, climate change driven still primarily by fossil fuel energy use. And we have 2 major drivers of overuse and damage on the natural resource side. In the ocean, fisheries still predominates every other driver significantly as the major driver of nature loss. Some through over-extraction, but primarily through other activities like bycatch and damaging gear use. And then agriculture, our old friend that keeps showing up here, is also still driving the primary source of overuse of fresh water in the US. Around 90% of consumptive water use in the US is still for agricultural irrigation. Even as efficiency increases, consumptive use is not declining in total. So those are our 8 major economic activities that are tied to the major changes in nature. Over all of these decades of these being issues, we've seen advance and innovation and change in all of those economic activities, and we now know most of them can be done in alternate ways that actually improve the environment. So we don't need to be doing damaging economic activities in most cases to continue supporting the economy. So we have a real opportunity with these 8 major drivers to turn them into drivers of natural and economic gain. So that's what we want to have you also focused on as we're brainstorming today, pulling out those 8 major drivers of economic activity that need to shift, and noticing then that these give us huge potential for policy ideas and innovation outside conventional environmental policy. These are economic activities, so it means we are firmly in the realm of potential for new ideas for economic policy, trade policy, tax code, subsidies, budgeting, anything that's normally in the realm of economic policy can become environmental policy. And we really encourage you to be thinking about those entry points because they are at the root of what drives the economy. So from that framework, the encouragement is just to think, can I think of policies that affect most or all of the major drivers of nature loss today? We do a lot of work and spend a lot of time thinking in silos. Push yourself today to not do that and think about what the functions of the federal government are that affect multiple sectors, that affect multiple agency economic decisions, and what are the ways that we can change those policies. So I just very quickly want to give an example of how we might use these frameworks in pushing our thinking today. So we might use the framework to come up with a fairly high leverage idea, like a new goal for the system. Perhaps we suggest that technology companies should reduce their habitat conversion 50% by 2050. So that's a nice focus on an economic actor. We could feel pretty good about that. But then if we remember our major drivers of nature loss, technology companies aren't a big driver in the US of habitat conversion. So that's not necessarily the highest leverage goal we could come up with. But having agriculture and infrastructure companies reduce habitat conversion 50% by 2050 touches right on the two primary drivers of habitat loss. So just a very, very simplified example to give you a sense of how we might use the frameworks in our thinking. So just to summarize, what we're, again, inviting you to do is to come up with ambitious policies that create an economy that recognizes nature at its core. With these frameworks, we'd love to aim for high leverage policies that affect many or all of the major drivers of nature loss. And we know that for any of these to do anything, someone has to be able to adopt and implement them. I actually don't want you to think about that today at all. So this is an invitation to just forget, as Jane said, about practicality and dream really big, because this is the start of several conversations that we're going to have this week and continuing through the summer. So here this morning, we really are hoping for blue sky, wide open, really ambitious thinking, no bounds, no practicality considerations, except that you could actually make a policy in the way that you're imagining. Then we're going to continue the conversation with some of the people in the room this afternoon and tomorrow to go deeper on these ideas, build more concepts and possibilities, and start thinking about the practical aspects of what might align with public interest. And then Thursday, we'll bring in a new group of policy leaders with fresh eyes and new lenses to bounce some initial ideas from all these conversations off of them and ask them to start to bring in those really firm, practical policy lenses about application. So we're not going to ignore it entirely, but we do want to ignore it today. So then Jane and I and potentially others will continue these conversations through the summer and aim to release a policy playbook on nature and national policy at the end of this year. So the idea, again, is to start sourcing the ideas here, build them, refine them, bring practicality into the picture, and then put something out that we all can act on. So what I want to end with is just a reminder of something that's really obvious, but I feel like we often forget, which is that everything in the economy that we have today is created by us, which means that everything about the economy that we have can be changed by us. So this is a tumultuous time. There's a lot of energy and disruption in the system. Let's harness it and use it and think really transformatively about what we can create and what the possibilities are for a very different economy. So I'll end there and then invite Jane and Taylor back up.
That was me, sorry. Okay, so we're going to do like a very brief Q&A up here in front of you all, because we want to keep it brief because we want to keep the time for your contributions at the full amount. So I'm just really curious listening to both of you, and I think it might be helpful if you can think of an example an existing one, not a future one, of a US policy or policy change that came the closest to that sort of upper right-hand corner on your graph of centering nature and transformative. Maybe nothing's ever been all the way up there, but what's gotten closest? Either of you. Do you want to start, Heather?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll say one that was policy and could be future because it's having a pause. So that is the guidance that was put out in the last administration on benefit cost analysis. So benefit cost analysis is, a standard methodology that every federal agency is required to use to evaluate major program changes, major rule changes, major funding program changes. And it typically does a fairly poor job of accounting for environmental costs and benefits. So there was guidance developed to help standardize and encourage regular assessment of bringing those costs and benefits into those major federal decisions. And that was released and established and then repealed, so there's an opportunity to reestablish that guidance. But I think it's a good example because it was a rule change that's fairly high leverage, and it affected all of the major drivers of nature loss because it affects all of the federal agencies that control those aspects of the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So another example that comes to mind, this is the 50th anniversary of the law that governs how U.S. Federal fisheries are managed, the Magnuson-Stevens Act. This is the 50th anniversary. And that legislation had major aspirational goals of having sustainable fisheries, use it and conserve it at the same time, use it but don't use it up. But in fact, through time, so 1976 was when that law was passed. So 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, we saw a significant, for you guys, decline in fisheries. And there was more and more overfishing, smaller stocks, fishing harder, more decline. And many of our fisheries were collapsing. That was true on the East Coast, it was true on the West Coast. And so there were major amendments made to this legislation in '96 that sort of tightened things up and provided the beginnings of changes in the way the Magnuson Act was made operational. But the big changes came in 2006 and 2007 with additional amendments that allowed, provided more teeth and timetables to actually end overfishing, not just an aspirational go forth and do well, but actually end overfishing with a certain deadline. And when I was the administrator of NOAA, we implemented a major policy change that in the way fisheries are managed in the US, instead of conventional fishery management, which is kind of a race to fish, all the fishermen are competing against one another, we allowed as an option, it wasn't mandated, but an option for the over 400 federally managed stocks and stock complexes in the US, the possibility of an alternate management system called catch shares, which is a rights-based management system that flips the incentives for fishermen to enable them to have a stake in the future and to be incentivized to be good conservationists and to not overfish. And going from conventional fishery management to this catch shares with the incentive to it aligned short and long-term incentives in ways that have been completely transformational for our fisheries. So there were other changes that happened along with this change in management, but the catch shares policy really resulted in ending overfishing, rebuilding fisheries, and today our fisheries are some of the best managed in the entire world. So you can feel, with a few exceptions, you can feel really good about eating any American caught seafood, and that's because of this legislation. So 2/3 of the fisheries in the US are now managed with a catch share policy by volume. So that's a lot, and it's been hugely transformative.
Yeah, those are really helpful examples. So I guess one final thing that might be helpful to the whole room is to hear, maybe we can start with you this time, Jane, who specifically you think the audience for the work we're embarking on today is. We talk about this playbook. Mm-hmm. Who do you hope, whose desk do you hope it lands on and when? Can you do a little more specific job of describing that?
So that's really important, Taylor, because it's not enough to just say something good should happen. We really have to have a specific actor in mind. And those actors could be members of Congress, they could be a specific secretary, or they could be a transition team, for example. Mm-hmm. And with the catch shares policy, there was a playbook that was provided to the transition team for the Obama administration. And that playbook recommended this major policy change. So that's a prime example of the way, one pathway to getting a policy change. It's certainly not the only one, but that is one that I think if the policy is right and the actors are right, having a transition team or a specific secretary of a department or somebody at OSTP or the Office of Management and Budget, Council on Environmental Quality, there are a number of potential targets.
Anything quick to add to that?
I just say, think of it as, any government actor, current or future, because a lot of people are still, working hard in government now,
Yep.
Have the opportunity to make changes, introduce new ideas, tweak 5 words that end up being the most powerful thing, that could have been done. So anyone in a current or future government role in the U.S. is the key audience.